Hey everyone, it's Jack and Carly. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a ton of interesting stuff to share. Actually, I'd say today is really important because we're going to look at the state of the menu, what's happening with restaurant menus, what has been the impact of COVID, and where do we see things going forward. And this is something that really materially affects a lot of us quite directly. Carly is one of our experts on menus and trends, and she's going to bring in a really fresh perspective on what the future holds for us. But I really wanted to just remind us all too, like we're all here sort of for each other in these sessions. So if you could please hit that chat button, and this is sort of a scientific research experiment too. I actually want to understand just from city to city, what is masking like right now? So if you could hit chat, make sure you choose the option that says either all panelists and attendees, or it might say everyone. I'm not sure what it says in your particular version of Zoom. Pick that and just put in chat what city you're in, and are people wearing masks outdoors, and how often are they wearing masks indoors at places? And I think we can together construct a pretty interesting mosaic of what the world looks like, or at least what this country looks like today relative to something like masking. So what city you're in, and how often are people wearing masks outdoors? How often are they wearing them indoors? Let us all know. With that, I wanted to get us started. I think you may have remembered, for those of you that were with us a couple of months ago, we launched something called Report Pro, which is sort of like our amazingly delicious all-you-can-eat buffet of insights at your fingertips. And what we do is we publish brand new reports every week. I think we're up to over 1,000 reports in the system now, with several reports coming out each week and hundreds of new reports a year. And what I wanted to start off each of these webinars with is just a quick overview of what are some of the new things you could find in Report Pro. So let me actually share this out for us real quick. I'm going to share my whole screen. It's probably the easiest. And let's see. So here's a Report Pro. We try to make this really easy to use. So you can sort of flip through it. You can see all the different new reports. And recently, some of the new issues that we've offered up are what's happening in the South. So we've broken out the country into the 4 major regions. And then there used to be a time when we were sort of all going to do dine-arounds in person at restaurants and checking them out. Now you can do it virtually and understand what trends are happening in different parts of the country. An issue on new global non-alcoholic beverages. What's happening with all of the new insights that we've sort of brought into the system recently. We have a deep dive into specific places like Montana and Boise and others. These are all pretty recent. A look at what's happening with artificial intelligence and menus. All the COVID information that we've been covering, you'll find in Report Pro as well. And report on labor shortages, what's happening with desserts, and it sort of goes on. And the easiest way is to maybe just go to our browse function, and you can see all the information that's being published. So I wanted to call attention to a couple of specific reports that you may find useful. One, we've launched what we call our segment recovery guides, which is as we emerge from the pandemic, what's happening in every segment of food service, from K through 12 to B&I to C&U, C-store, supermarkets, all the different restaurant segments, et cetera. What's happening on an operator basis? What are the trends? What are the headwinds? What are the tailwinds? So if you're working on your business in a segment specific way, these might be really helpful for you. The other is a brand new report series that we've just launched, and we'll be releasing multiple of these every week going forward, that we call these 5 in Focus reports. I'm going to open one of these up, and this one is on the labor shortage in particular. You can download it, but I'm just going to click read. And basically the idea is, you may not have time to read a 100-page deck, but there are lots of issues that are impacting us in the world of food all the time, and especially today. They just keep coming up and up and up. It's almost unpredictable. And we wanted to sort of distill each one of those down into the 5 key things that you want to know about that issue. So we're talking about labor shortage, and we break it down to the 5 things that you want to see, right? Are consumers noticing it? What is their level of tolerance if there are service disruptions due to issues with labor? What are they attributing labor shortages to? So enhanced UI is certainly something that came to the top of the list. What do operators think, about enhanced UI and other things that may be contributing to the shortage? And then also, what do they plan to do about it? You'll also get all the different tables and appendices to go with it. The nice thing is the report itself only takes a couple of minutes to read and to digest, but if you want the more detailed information, it's there too. So this is part of our new 5 in Focus series. There will be multiple of these added to Report Pro every week going forward. So we think it's great and just another easy way to get access to stuff that's really, really quite helpful. So what I'll do real quick is show you some of the new reports that you can expect in the coming month. Everything from challenges with supply chain to a deeper dive on ghost kitchens, what's happening in other parts of the country, a deep dive into what's happening with nuts and seeds specifically. And then if you go all the way down, we have things like federal relief programs, global beverages, and also 10 new inspiration reports, which are designed to get you thinking about any new product category, whether it's retail or food service. You know, I want to ideate against a brand new burger. What are the things that I really need to know about what's happening with burgers? It's all right in there for you. So I'm going to actually just launch something, and don't feel like you have to answer, but if you want to, please do. If you want to get any more info on Report Pro, I think many of you are already using it. Just click yes, and we'd be happy to get you some information about it. It is totally a great way to make your jobs and lives just much easier. So I'll let this run for a little bit, and then we will get on our way. Carly, I got to tell you, this thing has made my life a heck of a lot easier too, because there's just so much stuff. And we added a search function in the last couple of weeks, which makes things a lot better as well. But it's, you know, I put together a lot of decks for customers and stuff, or work on presentations. It's cut my work time down in a pretty significant way. So if you're interested, just click yes. We'd be happy to get you a little more info. All right, so let's get started. I think we've all seen the headlines recently that, you know, New York is now mandating vaccine at least 1 dose for you know, some entertainment venues as well as restaurants. If you follow sort of local news, it looks like LA and perhaps some other cities across the country are considering similar measures. And the question is, what do we think is going to be the impact of all this? So I'm going to click into this poll. And I'd like to ask you all. So I don't want, like, please don't think in terms of what you think is right or wrong. Let's think objectively about what you think the impact on the level of business will be if a vaccine mandate is placed on restaurants in a city. Do you think on average that that's going to help restaurant business because maybe people feel it's safer and more people are willing to go out into the restaurant? Or do you think it maybe hurts restaurant business because there's going to be, you know, a smaller population of qualified people that can actually visit, or for some other reason? So without inserting your personal opinion, I guess, about whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, it's, if this were enacted, do you think it would help or hurt business at restaurants overall? Carly, I actually did not know the way the voting would go today, and I can sort of see it live as it's sort of spooling in right now. Do you have any guesses as to where you think the voting will be? Do you think it's going to be evenly split? Do you think it's going to tilt one way or the other?
I think it's going to tilt towards would have an impact, because, you know, I think, you know, people's willingness to visit certain places, and I think there's been a lot of backlash against having to show a proof of vaccination somewhere as well. So I think that might rub a lot of people the wrong way.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating. So I'm gonna shut down this right now because I think we have several hundred votes already, but this is really sort of interesting. I'm going to share these results. It's basically 50-50, which I think sort of, actually in a way it surprised me because I thought we'd have an opinion one way or the other, but I also had no idea which way that was going to be. So I guess the 50-50 thing sort of makes sense in the end. But again, as with many things during COVID, we now have a giant live real world experiment, and I guess we will find out. One of the things we have been doing has been tracking things like foot traffic to restaurants. So we'll be able to look at the data hopefully in a couple of months and see what's actually transpired. Okay. All right, so with that, let's get into the main topic of the day, which is the state of the menu. What is happening with restaurant menus? So we've recently released our latest data on menus, and we decided to do sort of a deep sort of meta-analysis of menus to understand what the heck is going on at sort of a macro level. So not just which flavors are growing and which ones aren't growing, which we will look at too, but sort of holistically, systemically, what are the things that are happening with menus? And the primary tool we'll use for this analysis is our menu trend system, which looks at menus going back, I think 16, 17 years now, and has been tracked very, very consistently. So when we see something is ticking up or ticking down, we can know for sure that it actually is ticking up or down in the real world, because we've sort of mirrored the actual distribution of restaurants across the US. Here's a question for you all. Menus shrank by, I think we all know that menus probably got a little bit smaller last year. We didn't know the extent to which this happened, whether it was a giant effect or a really small effect, until we really explored the data. So this is maybe a question for you all to guess in chat, which is menus shrank by X%, by blank percent during COVID. What do you think that number is? Let's see if we get any good guesses over there. So when I say shrink, I mean that the size of the menu, like menus used to have 100 items on average. Now how many items do they have? What percentage shrink did we see on average during COVID? Carly, I'm not able to actually monitor chat when I have the screen share going. Are we getting any guesses?
Yeah, we're getting, it looks like everyone's guessing in the 30 to 50% range.
So this is interesting, right? And maybe without the benefit of having data, maybe I would have thought the same thing too, because I can remember lots of restaurants I've gone to that says, hey, our 50-item menu is now a 10-item menu. But this is, I think, one of those things where our judgment is sort of influenced by specific things that we see on a one-off basis, and we think that that's representative of what's happening more broadly. This is similar to what we saw with some of the stats that were floating around on restaurant closures. When people weren't looking at the actual data, it seemed like, oh my, 50% of all restaurants are going to close or something. But in the end, it ended up being about 12%. As far as menu shrink goes, the actual number is 10.2%. So there was certainly decline. This is a important and very significant decline, but it is nowhere near that 40, 50, 60% number that some of us may have had in the back of our heads. On average, across all types of restaurants, chains, independents, mom and pops, everything from taco shops to giant QSR burger places to sit down fine dining, the number is about 10.2%. So you want to think of 2021 menus being smaller than they were in 2020. And you might say, 10%, that doesn't sound like that big of a deal. It actually sort of is a big deal if you think about what it actually means, right? So if you put this in context of, I don't know, like how tall people are, if you shrunk people 10%, that would make the average adult male about 5 feet tall and the average adult female only 4'9", right? That would be a pretty dramatic change all of a sudden. That same change has happened with restaurant menus now. So 10% smaller menu means that things had a harder time to grow last year when the whole thing is just compressed by 10%. I mean, think about business. Imagine all of a sudden, you have a traditionally growing company and all of a sudden revenues are down 10% for a year, just unexpectedly out of the blue. It's going to change quite a lot of things. That's what we want to look at, is what those changes are, how they manifested. So let me ask you this. We know that overall menus got about 10% smaller last year, but what percentage of restaurants actually reduced the size of their menu? So this is a slightly different stat. The average menu got 10% smaller, but what percentage of restaurants had a smaller menu last year versus the year before, as opposed to a bigger menu or a menu that didn't change in size? What percentage of menus got smaller? And I invite everyone to venture a guess as well. What type of guesses are we getting, Carly, if any?
The 30, 50% range is what we're guessing. We've got some on the lower and the higher end, but it seems like everyone's within that range.
Okay, so let's take a look. So this is historically the percentage of menus that actually grew or shrank in terms of how big they are versus the prior year. So what percentage of all restaurants in 2008 grew their menu versus shrank their menu compared to 2007. And you can see the numbers going all the way up until today. The things that I would sort of call out, and we sort of put in yellow some of the more important numbers, we saw menu shrink during the financial crisis, and you could see where the numbers are over here, right? Not as many places grew their menu, certainly in 2009, and things sort of stabilized a bit in 2010. But when we look at the impact of the pandemic, that you had 60% of menus get smaller last year, right? That is unprecedented. It is unlike any number we've ever seen historically, including during the financial crisis and the period that follows. So this is, I think, what you could think of as just being a true overnight systemic shock to the system and to menus as sort of a follow-on effect. And the question is, when you have something that gets hit that hard, that fast, what does it imply for the rebound? And I think it's pretty clear to us that there are strong signals that the rebound comes back quicker as well. And I'll show you why in data. So we've had a systemically unprecedented decline in menu size last year, more so than we've ever seen in certainly our history. But I think it actually forecasts for us a better and more rapid type of restoration to normal or growth on menus in the period ahead. Before we get there, though, I would ask you all, and I think this is a totally logical answer to this question. Which parts of the menu do you think shrunk the most? Was it desserts, appetizers, beverages, side dishes, entrees, adult beverages? Which parts of the menu do you think were most resilient and shrunk the least? And which parts of the menu do you think shrunk the most? Let's give folks maybe 20, 30 seconds to throw some ideas out there. Just think about, what was open, what wasn't open, how service modes changed last year. What type of guesses are we getting, Carly?
Apps, entrees, and desserts. A couple votes for overall beverage or adult beverage.
Yeah, so let's take a look. So this is the number of items per menu in the year 2020. And here's the number of items per menu in 2021 and what the change looks like. And you can see there are a few categories in particular that saw the biggest declines: appetizers, desserts, and adult beverages. This makes total sense, right? You had a lot of places that just weren't open for indoor dining. And despite all the things that we've seen with cocktails to go and other new ways of doing things, you still had a lot of places that were just closed for a long time, and as a result did not focus on that part of the menu. Entrees and side dishes and traditional drinks, not adult beverages, but traditional drinks, tended to be a bit more resilient. Again, I think you're going to see a restoration to normal in some of the categories where the systemic declines were greatest, which means those are the categories that are going to bounce back the fastest because they have the most headroom to grow. If you take the same notion, and we flip the axes over here, so I apologize if it gives you vertigo. You got to tilt your head to make it look like the chart we just had, where we now have the parts of the menu running across the top. And we sort of broken this out too by the type of restaurant. And we've colored in yellow those parts of the menu at certain restaurant segments that have had double-digit declines in menu size. You notice a couple of things off the bat. One, adult beverages are down across the board. And yes, you do occasionally find an adult beverage even at places like QSR and certainly at fast casual. But across the board, adult beverages were not as prevalent on menus. And then in fine dining, it's almost didn't matter what category of the menu you're talking about. Just fine dining menus got a lot smaller last year. QSR menus tended to hold fairly steady. And then you have some spots where desserts got a little bit smaller on menus in places other than QSR, but it's sort of segment dependent. But this is sort of where the declines and a little bit of gain, like the tiny gains were eked out by side dishes at QSR and non-adult beverages at QSR as well. Everyone else, you had a decline, and in adult beverage across the board and fine dining across the board, you had really big declines. As a result, the composition of menus themselves has changed. So this is the share or the distribution, or I think share is probably a better word, the share of the menu. So what percentage of restaurant menus are comprised of appetizers versus entrees versus sides, desserts? And what we're showing in this chart is how those shares have changed over the course of the last year. So adult beverage has become relatively less represented on menus last year compared to the year before. Entrees and entrees in particular have become a little bit more represented on menus than they used to be. They're not dramatic changes, but look, if you're in one of these categories in particular, it probably will feel fairly dramatic to you, right? A 1.3% gain for entrees, yeah, it doesn't seem like you're thinking, that's 1%, it's not a huge number, but it's 1.3% from where it was previously, which is on a relative basis is decent growth and would actually have strong suggestions for you if you're in that category of the menu specifically. As we get further down, we track in menu trends about 11,000 different foods, flavors, ingredients, menu descriptors, healthy terms, preparation methods, you name it, are tracked inside of menu trends. And what we really wanted to understand is, well, how are these things doing individually, right? Is gochujang going up or down still, right? What terms are going up? What terms are going down on menus? What foods, what flavors, what ingredients? And if you look at this in aggregate, do you have more things increasing in popularity on menus over the last year? Or do you have more things decreasing in popularity on menus over the last year? And here's one way of looking at this. So if we look at the year 2020, we're gonna call this the pre-COVID menu, so before COVID, and we compare that menu with the year before, so 2019, you could see of those 11,000 different foods, flavors, ingredients, you name it, how many of them actually grew on menus versus shrank on menus? It's pretty close to a 50-50 split. It's not exactly 50-50, 55-45, but sort of close to 50-50. So roughly half of the 11,000 foods, flavors, ingredients grew from 2019 to 2020 on menus, and about half declined in some way. So Carly, this is actually, I think, pretty consistent with what we've seen for a period of time, and we'll look at some of the historic data as well. But you've often had some years where you had more gainers than you've had decliners, but it's usually not wildly in one direction or the next. The question is, if we go and look at the during COVID or post-COVID menu, what does this ratio of gainers and decliners look like? Here's what that is now. So throughout COVID and today, only about 18% of those foods, flavors, ingredients grew in menu commonality or popularity from the prior year, whereas over 80% of them actually declined. This is not surprising given that menus themselves shrunk, right? When you have a smaller menu, it's harder for more things to grow. But this is a pretty dramatic result, right? You know, most things got smaller. And when you look at trend information, you actually want to apply this lens, because if you see something that was down 1% last year, it's actually not a bad sign, right? Because the average thing may have been down 2 or 3% just because menus themselves got smaller. And it means that we have to look at both the short-term trend during COVID as well as what happened pre-COVID, or look at them in aggregate on something like a 4-year basis, like what's happened over a longer period of time, to really understand, is this a positive trend or not? So we don't want to get lost in the, hey, this thing didn't grow last year and say that's no longer a trend, because all evidence suggests that that is absolutely the wrong way to interpret the data. Everything was on average down a little bit. So if you weren't up a lot as a specific flavor, for instance, it doesn't mean that things aren't positive going forward, and we'll show you why. Let's take a look at these numbers in a little closer examination, though. So these are the same figures we just saw, right? We saw the 2020 gainers versus decliners number, and then we saw the 2021. In 2020, we had net gainers. You had, 55% were gainers, 44% were decliners. The net is a positive 11. In 2021, you had almost, you had very few gainers and a lot of decliners. So you went from a positive 11 net score in 2020 to a minus 65 in 2021. It's a wildly crazy swing. I mean, this is an enormous swing in the numbers. And the question is, what does this look like historically? Do we ever see anything like this? And one way of doing this is, let's just chart this thing out. So here we have a chart where you have that thing going through the middle is your zero line. And we're going to look at that net number we just saw, that plus 11, that minus 65 number. And we're going to see what that number looks like on menus throughout the last decade, roughly. And I'm going to plot a line and we can sort of see. So this pink line shows what that net gain or net decline looks like over roughly the past decade. And the first thing you notice is, yeah, sometimes you have net gains, sometimes you have net declines, right? It doesn't quite even out in the end because on average, menus have gotten a little bit bigger still, but things fell off a cliff in a totally unprecedented way in 2021. Not only have we never seen swings that big before from the prior year, we've never seen a net decline or net gain number anywhere remotely that extreme, ever. So 2021 is a totally different year than we've seen, and you almost have to think of it differently when assessing trend. And we've built some ways of reporting that help you do exactly that. So I don't know, Carly, if you have just sort of any thoughts on sort of the wild swings. You've looked at the data far more closely, I think, than I have. Just what you've seen in terms of what's growing and what's declining. Is there anything that's sort of jumped out as being surprising to you?
I think not surprising, but the things that continued to grow were big overall trends that kind of had other forces pushing them, like, of course, plant-based and sustainability, just the general appetite for spice and things like that. I think some earlier stage global things from other cuisines that had been trending and had been feeling very trendy, we saw decline slightly, not all of them, or their growth was flat. But we've seen in the research that people are still really excited for trends, and their interest in wane in terms of trends that they were excited about before the pandemic. So I think
this is true. And in the midst of the pandemic, when restaurants were closing, and menus got like seriously chopped at some places, and lots of staff were being laid off. We surveyed operators in the early part of the pandemic. I think this particular stat, I think, comes from like May maybe of last year. So, pretty height of the pandemic type of thing. You had a preponderance of operators that say trends will be more important going forward compared to pre-pandemic times. So the thing we did not see was any sort of an organic decline in operators being interested in bringing trends or new flavors or thing to their menu. What we saw instead was them being forced to just shut down entire portions of their menu, sometimes on a temporary basis, which is what caused some of this decline. And what you can actually do in menu trends, you can say, well, this is too much. I can't look at the whole world. I want to just look at certain things. I want to look at just sauces and flavors, or just cheeses, or just fruits, or just breads or noodles, you name it. And we wanted to sort of do a little bit of that analysis. And here's what we found. So we look at that same notion of gainers and decliners, but we break it down by the specific type of thing, right? So out of the 2,000 plus different sauces and flavors, I forget what the number is. There's a whole lot of them. How many of them gained versus declined versus stayed flat? You can sort of see what that ratio is. And you can see that ratio in 2020 versus 2019 again. So this is both pre-COVID in all of these categories. And as you might predict, I'm going to hit click and animate the next part of this chart that shows you the COVID numbers that we can compare them with. So here we have those in green, which is what do the during COVID or post-COVID menus look like compared to the pre-COVID menus. And you can see across the board, whether you're talking about different types of spices or breads or cheeses or all the different fruits and nuts and whatnot, you had far fewer things that actually grew on menus versus that declined on menus. So I think this gives us a pretty good insight that, it's not like operators said, oh, we're just not interested in flavors anymore, right? Or we're just not interested in certain things. It's just like, hey, everything sort of got smaller, which exerts a lot of pressure, making it hard for things to grow. Well, there's just not as much room to operate. Some of these things are pretty extreme though, right? You look in the case of nuts, only 2.3% of all the different types of nuts out there actually grew in prevalence on menus, right? That probably has something to do with the fact that dessert menus shrunk quite a bit last year. And if you look at some of these other categories as well, there are a couple that tend to be a little bit more resilient. Noodles, for instance, 27% of noodles managed to actually grow in 2021. I think this has something to do with the fact that maybe some of those things travel pretty well for delivery, and that part of the menu might have been a little bit less likely to have gotten axed or shrunk. And then entrees as a whole tended to hold up a bit better. So again, that 22.8% number, I don't know if you can see my mouse move around over here, is not saying the entree category. We're talking about all the things that are our entrees, chicken parmesan, lasagna, General Tso's chicken, etc. All those hundreds, if not thousands of different entree items, about 22% of the ones that moved up or down ended up moving up. About 77% of the ones that actually moved up or down moved to the downside, which is a better ratio than we see in some of the other categories. But again, across the board, you tended to have declines last year simply because menus got smaller and had less room to operate. But menu growth was possible last year. It was hard to grow on menus, but it could actually happen. And one way of sort of looking at this is to look at the distribution of growth on menus. Did things grow or shrink? And we're going to change our lens a little bit right now, where the axis going across the bottom is hard point change on restaurant menus. So if, let's say, I'm going to make up numbers now, so please don't read these numbers as real. Let's say lasagna used to be on 20% of menus, and now it's on 22% of menus. That would be a plus 2% hard point change, right? So we're not talking about relative change, we're talking about hard percentage gain, just subtracting number A from number B. And if we look across all those 11,000 different things that you might find on a restaurant menu, here's what the distribution looks like in the year 2019 versus 2018. So we're going pretty far back, right? So in the year 2019, how many things, grew 1% or 2% or shrunk 0.5% or shrunk 1% on restaurant menus versus the prior year? This is the curve that you get. It looks sort of like a bell-shaped curve, right? In 2020, again, 2020 versus 2019, again, pre-pandemic, here's what that curve looks like. It's a little bit different, but mostly the same, right? It skews a little bit more to the right, which makes total sense because menus got a little bit bigger in 2020 on average, so that there's more room for more things to grow. But it looks pretty much like that other 2019 curve, right? A normal distribution where things cluster around the middle and it sort of, dovetails off on both sides, both extremes. So here's what it looks like if you plot out the prior 10 years. So each one of these colored lines is a different year. And again, the lines, sometimes they diverge a little bit, but for the most part, the last decade coming into COVID pretty much looks the same. They all look sort of like that bell-shaped normal distribution, right? Where sometimes the lines right down the middle at 0% where it's highest, sometimes it skews a little bit to the right, but it's taller in the middle and it sort of fans out and gets much smaller as you move further and further away to the high negative numbers or the low negative numbers. So that's historic. So the bell-shaped curve, it really is a hallmark of what menu evolution typically looks like. So we look at 2019 and 2020 again, and then we say, well, now I want to look at the 2021 data, the new data, the data that includes COVID and how that compares with the pre-COVID stuff. Here's what that curve looks like. This is a crazy looking curve for a number of reasons. It is dramatically different than anything we've ever seen before. And I mean, you could see it instantly. The shape of it is different. The peak is way lower than it has been in any other year, which means there's lots more activity that's not happening in the middle of the curve. You know, there's more stuff going on in the extremes. That bell-shaped curve we normally think of has sort of vanished for the first time that we've ever seen, right? Which again suggests that this is a systemic, non-organic change. It's not, you know, something that happens naturally. It's more like, you know, meteor smacks the earth, and this is sort of the aftermath of it. And a couple of things that we noticed is that one, you don't have a whole lot of stuff in that right side tail, right? You don't have, you know, the numbers start getting pretty small when you start thinking about, you know, what actually grew 0.5% or 1% or more on menus, right? Normally that tail extends quite a bit further out. Here, by the time you get to 0.5% or 1%, you're getting to really, really small numbers of items that actually manage that much hard point growth. The other thing I would notice is that, what the heck is this on the left-hand side? This is very strange, right? Normally the curve sort of like flattens out and, you know, just goes to zero at some point. But here it starts flattening out as you would normally expect, but all of a sudden it spikes and you have a massive number of things that are down more than 2% on a hard point basis, which is totally unexpected, right? How can that happen? It's so unnatural. So we have this unprecedented decline among several different foods, flavors, and ingredients. And, you know, being researchers, we sort of asked ourselves, this is strange. We need to look into this and figure out what this is. So we started investigating what those things are that had this really bizarre looking decline that when we just saw this chart, we sort of said, I don't think this chart is right. But it turns out the chart is absolutely right. And if you start looking at what falls into that left-hand side of the tail with that giant spike, which is just so odd, we start learning a few things. So we saw that there were really outsized declines in a few specific areas of the menu. And here's, I'd say, the top three. There's a few more than this, but these are really the top ones. One, breakfast items dropped a lot. Two, beverages in many cases dropped a lot. This includes both non-alcoholic and in some cases alcoholic and vice versa. And three, also foods that are really sort of associated with dining inside of a restaurant and not so much associated with takeout or delivery. And if you just look at some of these examples, right? So in the case of breakfast items, we saw hard point declines of 5 points for coffee. It's huge. French toast, eggs Benedict, and a much longer list as well, right? As a lot of places just didn't offer breakfast anymore. They either slashed or in many cases just said, we don't have a breakfast menu anymore. We're just not open for that time of day. Commuter traffic is gone. We don't need to offer this anymore. Or we've cut staff back and instead of doing, you know, 3-day parts, we're just working on a single shift and we're just gonna offer 2-day parts instead. We also saw drops in things like beverages because as fewer people are inside of a restaurant, dining in for full service and more ordering things like delivery, you know, people don't order beverage for delivery nearly as much. People tend to order entrees for delivery. Sometimes they don't order desserts for delivery either, and they take something out of their own fridge instead. But beverage is the one part of the menu that gets sort of most hammered in that scenario because people will often say, hey, I already have my beverage of choice in my refrigerator, so I don't need to order that from the delivery service. So a lot of places just didn't offer as many beverages as they used to. And then dine-in centric foods, and the list sort of goes, you know, much longer than this. Different types of fish, you know, steak. I've never had a steak for delivery. I'm guessing there's probably a way to do it well. I've not ventured down that path yet myself, and it seems like a lot of other consumers may not either, or certainly some restaurants certainly felt like it wasn't worth focusing as much on something like that. And then, you know, like scallops and other things that you really associate with eating in a restaurant, made totally fresh for you, brought to your table, those saw declines as well. These to us feel like you know, declines that are the result of a systemic, one-time, immediate shock to the system, as opposed to, you didn't have a lot of operators or chefs saying, you know what, I don't like eggs Benedict anymore, let me take those things off. It wasn't that. It wasn't them saying, you know what, I'm not so crazy about scallops anymore. It wasn't anything like that. It's just, hey, we're not going to offer breakfast anymore. Hey, we're doing mostly delivery now, so the beverage piece doesn't matter as much anymore. Or, we don't think people are going to want to order scallops for delivery. I mean, that's literally what drove that crazy left-hand side of the tail, right? Driven primarily by a sudden shift in the world. And we think it's a temporary phenomenon that's going to reverse itself, and trends will grow again, unless we believe that these places will forever, never, ever offer breakfast again, which I just don't think is the case. How about all the other trends? So there are about 570 trends prior to the pandemic that were growing at a substantial rate. That means they were growing at least 5% on a one-year basis prior to the pandemic, and at least 20% on a four-year basis. And this is relative, right? This is not hard point change. This is relative change. So if you go from 10% penetration to 15% penetration, that would be 50% growth on a relative basis. So of those 569 trends, 40% of them continued growing during COVID, which means that about 60% of them that were trends sort of stopped, or in some cases even reversed slightly during COVID. So not everything that was already in motion tended to stay in motion, because we had this systemic shock to our world and certainly to menus as well. We think that those trends that stopped are likely to unstop and continue trending forward. And perhaps the easiest way to understand this, let's look at one of them. Hibiscus would be an example. This is the historic menu penetration of hibiscus. So hibiscus was found on 1.9% of menus in 2011, and it kept going up and up and up and up and up. And normally we would have predicted 2021 to be another up year, because it's just been growing so fast. But instead, it just flattened, right? It's really weird to see this curve ever, but in the age of COVID, it makes total sense. The question is, what's going to happen in the future? I think you could actually intuit this without even looking, into any of our AI projections or anything. Just ask yourself, what do you think is going to happen? This thing has been a trend. It's been going on for a long time. All of a sudden, there's a systemic shock to menus where things like beverages and whatnot, desserts, some of the places where hibiscus might play, just go away. What's going to happen as the world resumes to normal? It certainly seems to me like there's still going to be upward pressure on this trend. One, to catch up to where it should have been anyways, because we've lost a year of that. And two, the long-term trend still looks really, really robust, which is why you no longer want to just look at what happened in the last year. You have to look at the context over a period of time to understand what a post-COVID reality looks like. That said, we said there were other trends that were trends coming into COVID and just kept on rocking, right? COVID can't slow me down. And I wanted to share maybe just a few of these, and Carly's going to get into some real details for us as to what we think the future looks like. Non-alcoholic beer, in this case specifically Heineken 0.0 and others, had a great year on menus during COVID, right? They jumped from a 0.5% penetration to triple that number over the course of the year. Still in the world of adult beverage, we have crazy growth for White Claw. And this is really impressive. It went from under 2% to over 5% in that year. Again, even in a time when adult beverage menus were shrinking in size. Cauliflower pizza crust also growing almost 70% during COVID. Again, any growth during COVID is pretty impressive. And these foods, flavors, ingredients, beverages are posting some really robust numbers. Let me ask you this. What do you think is the fastest growing healthy related term on menus? Right, so put it in chat. Think of all the things that could describe healthy eating, right? Low fat, sustainable, use a broad umbrella for this. In chat, what do you think is the fastest growing healthy term on menus during COVID?
And 2 people get it so far.
So I was surprised by this. I wasn't super surprised when I saw the end, but I would have guessed something different, I think. I probably would have guessed immunity maybe would have been the number one term, but it wasn't. It was actually ketogenic, growing about 63% during COVID. Let's try one more quiz. What's the fastest growing seasoning on menus during COVID? This is something we've talked about a number of times in the past as a big future trend. And I think this is one of those trends that just said, COVID can't slow me down. What is the fastest growing seasoning on menus during COVID? This is a hard one to guess, I think.
We have also had a handful of people that have gotten this, but I'm seeing lots of great overall guesses too.
We've actually got some right answers.
We do, yeah.
I think those people should be acknowledged for being exceptionally bright, and maybe we'll invite you on the next webinar to give a talk, because that's pretty impressive. That'd be tahini, which is up about 40% during COVID and leads all spices and seasonings in growth during that period. And finally, what is the fastest growing fruit or veggie on menus last year?
Oh, wow, someone got it right on the first guess.
I wonder if my I wonder if my presence on this webinar is biasing the answer to this one, because indeed the fastest growing fruit or veggie has been jackfruit, which still managed to grow in a time of decline, up 30% during COVID, often used as a meat replacer for things like pulled pork. I know, Carly, you've done a lot of work on jackfruit in particular. And the term plant-based also continued to grow. That's probably one of the questions we got asked most often as far as trends go during COVID is, what's going to happen to plant-based? Will it keep growing? As far as menus go, even COVID could not slow it down.
And
so we think trends, oh yeah, go ahead, Carly.
Something interesting is actually happening with jackfruit as it's growing. You mentioned pulled pork, and when it hit menus, that was pretty much the primary application we saw as a plant-based replacer for pulled pork. Now we're seeing some seafood. We're seeing some jackfruit crab cakes and things like that. So it's kind of evolving in its usages as a plant-based replacer.
Oh, that actually sounds pretty interesting. I mean, I've had some of the jackfruit tacos and stuff at places. It's fantastic. It's really, really great. So if you had a chance to try it in an entree or an appetizer, you owe yourself that opportunity. As a whole, I mean, given everything we saw, that it's primarily an operational thing that happened that caused menus to get smaller. It's not chefs organically making those decisions or anything. It's not culinary people or innovation people saying, oh, we're not as interested in these trends anymore. It was an operational thing where stuff just shut down for the most part that caused this. We think trends are poised to not just rebound and start making up some of that ground they lost so quickly last year, but we think they're going to not just rebound, they're also going to accelerate going forward as well. We see so many trends that are speeding along, and the thing that characterizes trends for the last several years is there's not just one thing. Like we just showed maybe a couple examples here, but there's hundreds, or in the case, I think we saw 569 things that were growing on menus. They're all trends. There's no single poster child for trends. The poster child is now that it's a collage of many, many different trends. And with that in mind, Carla, I thought you could maybe take us through some of the things that you're seeing as well.
Absolutely. So the first one that we noticed in the data is looking at appetizer menus. The word taco was growing, and it means octopus in Japanese. And when you take a look at the appetizer menu example specifically, that's due to takoyaki. So this is pictured here. It's a classic Japanese street snack. There's like a fried dough and octopus, and it's often topped and loaded like we saw here. And it's actually evolving as it hits menus in the US. There's a really cool menu example we found where they're actually chili cheese loaded takoyaki and kind of a mashup dish there too.
I don't know how I feel about chili cheese loaded takoyaki, but okay, we'll let it go. What do we have here?
This is popper. So this is growing in entree menus. And we have the kind of classic jalapeno popper appetizer, which is what it's referring to here. But on entree menus, popper evolves and begins to look a little different. And we see it with some of our kind of classic safe experimentation formats like burgers, sandwiches, and pizzas, all being created with primarily jalapeno cream cheese. Often bacon is included in a popper format. And what we have here is an example from Bob's Burgers and Brew. They're a chain mostly based in Washington, and they've got their jalapeno popper burger right here. And you can see we've got a layer of cream cheese. On top of the cream cheese, it's actually a sweet chili sauce, which is kind of a cool twist. Jalapenos, and then a classic burger built too. So something, it's interesting to me because poppers are not, a new item. Burgers are not a new item, but you put the two together and you create something really new and interesting.
So this is the thing where a popper was an item and now it's almost like a flavor in a way. Is it sort of like s'mores? Like s'mores were a thing and now s'mores are a flavor of things?
Absolutely.
Sort of.
And it's not happening just inside pizzas and burgers too. This is from Kolache Factory, which is a chain in Texas. And kolaches are Czech pastries that kind of immigrated with Czech immigrants to the US as they settled in Texas. And they're originally sweet. They're stuffed with like jam and poppy seeds, but in Texas, they've become more savory. They're often stuffed with things like sausage, eggs, and bacon, and they've become really like a regional Texas thing. And this is Kolache Factory's jalapeno popper kolache, and they actually put it on the menu as an LTO. It's got cream cheese, jalapenos, and bacon, and it became so popular that they had to put it on their permanent menu.
Fantastic. I feel like I've seen a lot of this. I see it all around me, but tell us about it.
This is Nashville hot. So here we can see that growth, and that growth has continued into 2021. So this is one of those items that really, weathered the pandemic very well. It's already in the proliferation stage of the menu adoption cycle. And on the next slide, we've got a picture of Nashville hot in kind of its classic form, the fried chicken with that hot oil and the bread. But something interesting is happening to Nashville hot as it has evolved as a trend. And on the next slide, we have what it looks like on menus now. And it's not that classic Southern fried chicken dish anymore. Now it's tacos and pizzas and even mac and cheese. And we can see that happening at chains too, if we take a look at Scores LTOs. So we've got
look at some of these examples, right? So you have a taco, you have it on a pizza, you have a mac and cheese. I live in Nashville. We have way too many Nashville hot things out here. It's gone overboard. You can get hot chicken sushi. I don't need hot chicken sushi or many other things. So we should certainly innovate with it. But I guess we're going to test the boundaries of what you can do with this pretty soon, because it's showing up everywhere, right? Over 100 new items and LTOs that are Nashville hot in some way in just the last few years. It's a ton. What do you see here, Carly, that sort of jumps out at you?
That Nashville hot burrito really jumps out at me. That's a cultural fusion dish. And you can see here, I think in Scores, it had a specialty appeal. People were interested in trying it because it seemed really new.
Yeah, it is just a ton of activity here. I guess we'll see it keep going.
I have to ask Jack, has it made its way into dessert yet? Like a Nashville hot ice cream or something?
I've seen that. I've seen it somewhere. I think I was at a restaurant and they had a Nashville hot dessert, and I said, "This has gone too far. That's too much." Sauces and flavors.
So if we take a look at just some savory sauces and flavors that have grown on app, entree, and side menus, Spicy and Global has really continued to grow. And when we were talking about Nashville hot, it's really kind of transcended the dish form and become a flavor in and of itself. And taking a look at some of these dishes, there are other global dishes like tinga, for example, that have the opportunity to do that. But I really want to take a look at mapo, which is referring to mapo tofu, which is a classic Szechuan dish. And if we take a look at Mapo's overall growth on menus, it's grown by 88% over the past 4 years. And we're seeing, similar to Nashville hot, we're seeing innovations happening where it's kind of transcending that dish format and becoming more of a flavor.
So the superstitious part of me says this is going to be huge because Mapo was a Chinese thing and 88 is a very lucky number in Chinese culture. So maybe it keeps going. We're going to apply some horoscope to our future prediction.
So this is Chef Yu Bao. He has a very famous restaurant called Yu's Family Kitchen in Chengdu, China. Him and his wife split their time between Chengdu and Los Angeles. And when he's here in the States, he does a lot of pop-ups. And he created this dish. So this is his take on mapo tofu, kind of drawing inspiration from Californian cuisine and the classic Sichuan cuisine. And he created mapo tofu with avocado, which you can see here. And he really wanted to examine the kind of textural play, the avocado, you know, that mellow fatty flavor with like the spiciness and how it plays off the tofu too. So that's just, you know, a way of adapting the dish itself by adding an additional element.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a lot of the things that we think of as almost ubiquitous or common flavors, the things that you find in like an American or varied menu restaurant, start off with very specific applications in other parts of the world, right? So that's similar evolution of this. I would say this is a very serious looking person over here. I feel like his food has to be good.
The next one we're seeing, and this is actually a really cool restaurant. It's delivery or takeout only. It's in New York City, and it's called Nice Day Takeout. And it operates out of Junzi Kitchen, which is a Chinese fast casual. And Junzi, even before the pandemic, was really focused on, you know, preserving American Chinese food. You know, there have been a lot of decline in some of these restaurants that they've noticed in recent years because the owners are retiring. Maybe the family doesn't want to keep the restaurant coming. So they announced a $5 million effort to modernize several of these restaurants that were in danger of shutting down and continue to have them serving this food. So Nice Day Kitchen is part of that. And the chef, Lucas Sin, said that Nice Day is about honoring classics while also building a restaurant for the future. And this is their Mapo mac and cheese. So kind of similar to that Nashville hot mac and cheese we saw. They're taking that flavor and they're combining it with mac and cheese.
Looks delicious.
It does.
What is this? This looks awesome.
This is actually from a restaurant in Hong Kong called Bao Bei, and these are mapo tofu fries. And that's kind of a classic safe experimentation thing that we see with some, you know, trendy dishes is everyone loves French fries, slap it on top of some French fries, put some cheese on it, you know, it makes it very, very approachable. And you can see here, we've got, you know, the mapo, the tofu, the green onions, and that lovely bed of French fries.
This is something you eat with a fork for sure, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Carly. And I know we're almost out of time. I just wanted to boil down, I guess, some of the big lessons that we've learned, and there certainly are many more that we'll be publishing over time. One is that menus we think are going to grow now as operations restored fully, right? That all the day parts that they used to offer start coming back. This may not be true in some pockets where, deep downtown areas that are all office buildings that people only work 3 days a week out of, as opposed to 5 days a week in the office. Then you probably have some places not doing as much, breakfast, for instance, or happy hour or something. But for the most part, we think menus will grow as operations restore mostly back to full. Two, we think all those things that were trends, or the vast majority of things that were trends pre-COVID, will resume because we haven't seen any sort of organic pushback against those trends themselves. It's really been a reaction to an operational event that happened that caused that systemic decline and that crazy left-hand side of the tail we saw in that one chart. And three, things like global influences in particular, we think have among the healthiest opportunities to grow going forward. So we all should have a healthy innovation pipeline already built for the future at this point. If you don't, you got to get working on it right now, because as people keep getting back into restaurants, they are going to want something new. That first trip back, maybe they want to have their favorite they haven't had for a while, but eventually it's going to be their second trip, third trip, fourth trip. They're going to want new things again. Thanks again, Carly, for coming in. And as just for everyone else, thank you all for joining us. We're here for whatever you need. If you want to learn more about Report Pro, it has made, I think, all of our lives easier over here, just getting access to all the stuff that we've published and putting it at our fingertips in a way that we've never been able to search before. But you can have all you can access to this. Just contact us, and we'll give you the details you need. And if you just want to say hi, shoot us a note. We're always happy to chat.